At my sister's lavish dinner party, she wrapped an arm around me and said, "This is Claire, my kid's nanny." The guests smiled politely, their eyes skimming over me as if I barely existed. I felt my chest tighten, not from shame, but from the secret I carried. 3 months from now, these same people would see me on the main stage of a global conference. My name on every screen, my story in every headline. But that night, I simply raised my glass and smiled. Let her think she'd won. The truth was, the game had only just begun. The crystal chandeliers threw shards of light across the dining room, making every glass of wine gleam like it belonged in a magazine spread. Victoria floated from guest to guest, her laughter soft but calculated, her heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that announced control. When she reached me, she draped an arm across my shoulders, the faint scent of her expensive perfume curling into my nose. "This is Claire, my kid's nanny," she said, as if she were presenting a piece of fine furniture. The conversation around the table paused for a breath, and then polite smiles flickered my way. Someone gave a nod, another offered a restrained, "How nice." Their eyes slid past me in search of someone more interesting, someone more important. I felt the corner of my mouth lift, a small knowing curve that wasn't the submissive smile they thought it was. Inside, something stirred, a quiet, deliberate awareness. 3 months from now, these same people would be looking at me differently, much differently. Victoria's hand left my shoulder, already moving on, to refill glasses and collect admiration. I stood still for a moment, my fingers tracing the stem of my wineglass, letting the hum of conversation blur around me. My eyes met those of a man across the table, sharp suit, sharper gaze. And for a fraction of a second, I thought I saw recognition. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but before the words could form, Victoria appeared at his side, interrupting with a laugh too loud to be natural. "If you were me, standing there with a label that wasn't yours, what would you have done? Would you have corrected her, right there in front of everyone? Or would you have done what I did, smile, drink, and tuck the insult away for later use?" I wasn't always this restrained. 3 years earlier, I would have spoken up. But 3 years earlier, I hadn't given up my career for my family. Back then, I was the youngest director in my firm, my calendar filled with meetings in cities that required a passport. Then my father's health declined, the family business teetered, and Victoria, polished, persuasive Victoria, called me home. "It's just for a little while," she'd said. "We'll get everything sorted, then you can go back." I wanted to believe her. I did believe her. So I quit my job, sold my condo, and moved back into the small coastal town we'd grown up in. It didn't take long for the red flags to start waving, though I ignored them at first. The first came when Victoria borrowed $10,000 to cover emergency expenses, and then, months later, acted as if the conversation had never happened. The second was the way she introduced me, if she introduced me at all, at her social events. "This is my sister, Claire. She's between jobs." The third red flag was her uncanny timing. She only called when she needed something, picking up her children, running errands, handling personal paperwork. Never for coffee, never to ask how I was doing. Then came the isolation. She began excluding me from family group chats, insisting it was just for parents or about things you wouldn't care about. At family gatherings, I noticed how I was always the one taking the photo, never in it. On the rare occasion I was, she managed to stand front and center, my presence half obscured. Gaslighting was her favorite sport. If I brought up any of it, she'd tilt her head and say, "You're being too sensitive, Claire. Don't overthink." And when all else failed, she used her children as shields. "They really need you right now," she'd sigh, making me feel as though refusing would be an act of cruelty. I told myself it wasn't worth fighting over. I told myself that keeping the peace was more important than keeping score. But that night, in her glittering dining room, I realized the peace was one-sided. She'd built her reputation on my silence, and my silence was costing me more than I knew. The man in the sharp suit caught my eye again later in the evening, this time near the bar. "Haven't I seen you somewhere?" he asked, a faint frown on his face, searching his memory. Before I could answer, Victoria's hand landed on his arm. "She gets that a lot," she said with a quick laugh. "Must be one of those familiar faces." Then, lowering her voice just enough for me to hear, "Why don't you help with the dessert trays, Claire?" I took the silver tray from the caterer, moving through the crowd with practiced ease, offering sweets to people who would forget my name within minutes. Every thank you and how kind slid off me like water on glass. But inside, I was storing it all. The slight from her introduction, the interruption when someone almost recognized me, the way she kept me in the shadows as if she could erase the life I had before I came back. I wasn't erasing anything. I was writing it all down, in the quiet place in my mind where grudges became strategies. The rain had stopped just as I pulled into Victoria's driveway, the wet pavement reflecting the glow of paper lanterns strung across the backyard. Laughter spilled from inside the house, punctuated by the shrieks of children running in and out. I carried the gift in both hands, wrapped in silver paper with a pale pink bow, something my niece had been talking about for months, a handmade jewelry kit imported from a small craft shop overseas. She'd told me it was the only thing she wanted this year. Inside, the living room was a flurry of color. Balloons, a cake taller than my forearm, a table groaning under the weight of appetizers. Victoria moved through it all like the hostess she was born to be, commanding attention without ever asking for it. When the time came for gifts, everyone gathered in a circle, phones raised, the air humming with expectation. My niece tore through brightly wrapped packages, squealing with delight at each one. And then, there it was, the silver paper, the pale pink bow. But when the tag came into view, my breath caught, written in flowing black ink, from Aunt Victoria. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but my mouth curved into a smile. My niece beamed and threw her arms around Victoria, who accepted the hug with a modest shake of her head, as though she were embarrassed by the attention. "Let's get a photo," someone called. We clustered together in front of the cake, the flash bright against our faces. I stood just behind Victoria, my smile frozen, eyes locked on the camera lens. It was a small, deliberate act, but it was my way of saying, "I won't forget this." The party swirled on. Children darted between legs. The music played too loud. And the adults exchanged the same well-polished compliments they always did. I helped clear plates, poured drinks, and accepted thank yous from guests who thought I'd done such a lovely job helping out. Hours later, when the house had emptied and the lanterns were swaying in the cool night air, I drove home in silence. My apartment was dark, the faint scent of rain still lingering in the air. I set my bag down, kicked off my shoes, and pulled an old photo album from the shelf. The pictures were faded but familiar. Victoria and me as children, chasing each other through the yard, building forts out of blankets. We had been inseparable once. I traced my finger over her face in a photo where we both wore crooked birthday hats, our cheeks pink from laughing. Somewhere along the way, that bond had turned into something else, something sharp and self-serving. I stared at the images for a long time, wondering if she ever thought about those days, or if I was the only one keeping them alive. The next morning, I returned to her house to help clean up. The air smelled of frosting and extinguished candles, the quiet almost jarring after the chaos of the night before. I was gathering stray party hats when I noticed a pile of toys in the corner of the living room. My niece's jewelry kit sat on top, unopened. As I bent to pick it up, a slip of paper fluttered to the floor. I caught it before it slid under the couch. It was an invoice, official letterhead, itemized charges. My eyes skimmed the details, my pulse quickening. It was a transfer from the family trust, dated 2 weeks earlier, marked for emergency disbursement. The amount was significant, and the recipient's name, printed neatly at the bottom, was Victoria's. She hadn't said a word about this. I knew enough about the trust to understand that these funds were meant for medical emergencies or legal necessities, not whatever this was. I folded the paper and slipped it into my bag, my mind already turning. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet, but I knew it mattered. It was the first tangible proof I'd seen of something I had long suspected, that Victoria's carefully curated image hid more than just petty slights. As I continued to tidy the room, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass doors leading to the patio. My face looked calmer than I felt. Inside, a decision was forming, not the rash, emotional kind I might have made a few years ago, but something steadier. I would no longer be the passive sister who absorbed every insult and stayed silent for the sake of family peace. I didn't know exactly how or when, but the rules had shifted. From here on out, I would watch, I would listen, and I would collect. And when the time came, I would be ready. The invoice from the family trust sat in my desk drawer for 3 days before I touched it again. I didn't want to move too quickly. This wasn't about an impulsive confrontation anymore. This was about building a foundation no one could knock down. On the 4th day, I opened my laptop and typed a name I hadn't said out loud in years: Michael Hart. Michael had been my direct report at the firm before I left. He was sharp, discreet, and the kind of person who noticed details others missed. I sent him a casual email, framing it as a catch-up after far too long. He replied within hours, suggesting lunch downtown. Over salads, we talked about everything but my real reason for reaching out. I asked about the company, our old projects, who had moved where. He caught me up on the gossip, and I laughed at the appropriate moments. Only when the plates were cleared did I lean back and say, "Do you remember that conference I was supposed to headline before I left?" "Of course," he said. "They were devastated when you pulled out. Why?" I reached into my bag and slid a folder across the table. Inside was the original contract, signed, dated, with my name printed in bold across the top. The one Victoria had claimed was misplaced during my move home. I'd found it tucked inside an unrelated box months later, and for some reason I'd kept it. Michael's brows lifted. "You could still use this. The conference is annual. They'd take you back in a heartbeat. I smiled but said nothing. 2 days later, I made another call, this time to Jenna Morris, a PR consultant I'd met through a mutual friend years ago. Jenna had a way of turning quiet stories into front-page news. When I told her I was considering stepping back into the public eye, she listened without interrupting. "If you want impact," she said finally, "don't just book a speaking gig. Show up where it matters most to your audience." "My audience?" I asked, though we both knew what she meant. "Your sister," she said plainly. "She's attending the Global Women's Leadership Conference in May. It's one of her big networking plays. If you were to appear there, on stage, it would change everything." I didn't respond right away. My eyes drifted to the corner of my desk, where a single, unopened envelope rested. Inside was a plane ticket I'd booked months ago, before I even knew what I'd do with it. Quietly, I pulled it out and set it on the desk, the destination printed in bold. The next morning, I laid the ticket flat on the table in my kitchen, staring at it while my coffee went cold. I didn't post about it. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. The ticket was my own silent cliffhanger, even to myself. That afternoon, I began outlining my speech. I set up my laptop by the window, the cursor blinking against a blank page, but the words wouldn't come. My mind kept drifting back to a winter long ago when I was 9 and caught the flu so badly I couldn't get out of bed. Victoria, only 12 at the time, brought me soup, changed my blankets, and read to me from a worn copy of Anne of Green Gables. She'd sat there for hours, the room smelling faintly of lemon and soap, until I fell asleep. Remembering that version of her, the girl who once put my comfort before her own, was like pressing on a bruise I thought had healed. It slowed me down. It reminded me that the person I was preparing to confront was also the person who had once been my safe place. I almost closed the laptop. Almost. Jenna called later that week. "I have news," she said. "The conference organizers are finalizing the keynote lineup. I floated your name and they're interested. But Claire, this isn't just any conference. It's being live streamed. We're talking global audience, archived forever." I let the weight of that sink in. This wasn't just about being in the same room as Victoria anymore. This was about being in every room she'd ever walk into after that day. My fingers tapped against the desk. "Let's do it," I said finally. When I hung up, I glanced again at the plane ticket on my table. It no longer felt like a question mark. It felt like a promise. The Global Women's Leadership Conference smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished ambition. The lobby shimmered with glass and chrome, filled with women in tailored suits, name badges swinging from lanyards. My heels clicked against the marble as I walked toward the backstage entrance, the fabric of my navy suit whispering with each step. My hair was pulled into a sleek bun, my notes in one hand, my phone silenced in the other. From behind the curtain, I could hear the hum of the audience. Then a pause, and the MC's voice rang out. "Please welcome our next keynote speaker, Claire Anderson." I stepped into the lights. For a moment, the glare obscured the crowd, but then the faces came into focus, and there she was. Victoria, front row, leaning slightly forward, her lips parting in a gasp she didn't have time to hide. Her hand twitched toward her phone before she caught herself. I walked to the podium, let the applause settle, and spoke into the silence. "Today I want to talk about the person who once turned me into a nanny, but without meaning to, taught me how to become a strategist. The audience leaned in. In the second row, someone shifted uncomfortably. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Victoria's eyes narrow. I clicked to the first slide. On the screen appeared a grainy photograph. Two little girls in paper crowns, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning as if the world had no edges. Murmurs rippled through the room. I let the image sit there, softening the air before I spoke again. This is my sister and me, before the titles, before the masks, before I understood that love and loyalty could be used as currency. Gasps, whispers. A woman in the back row raised her phone, capturing the moment. I told them about the years I spent helping my family, about the small ways a person can be erased without a single raised voice. I didn't name Victoria directly. I didn't have to. Each story was a puzzle piece, and the picture formed itself. As I spoke, I could see the duality on faces in the crowd, admiration and discomfort, the recognition of something they'd perhaps lived through themselves. When I finished, the applause was loud, sustained. By the time I stepped off stage, my phone was buzzing with notifications. Jenna met me in the wings, her grin sharp. "It's already on Twitter and LinkedIn. You're trending." Within an hour, clips of my speech were ricocheting across social media. The quote about the nanny turned strategist was everywhere, pasted over still frames of me at the podium. Strangers commented with their own stories of betrayal and resilience. A few asked pointed questions in the thread about the sister. Then came the third twist. In the middle of the post-event networking session, a tall man in a charcoal suit approached me. I recognized him instantly. Richard Harlow, CEO of a major firm Victoria had been courting for months. "I think I've heard your story before," he said, extending his hand. Only the version I heard painted someone else as the hero. Interesting to get the facts from the source. He didn't elaborate, but his meaning was clear. Whatever image Victoria had sold him, it was unraveling. I thanked him, kept my composure, and made my way toward the exit before the crowd could close in again. That evening, I returned to my hotel room. The adrenaline was still humming in my veins, but now it was tangled with something else, something heavier. I kicked off my heels, loosened my hair, and sat on the edge of the bed. The city outside my window glittered, but I barely saw it. The tears came quietly, as if they'd been waiting all day for permission. Relief, because I had finally spoken. Grief, because no matter how true my words were, they had driven the final nail into what little bond remained between us. I pressed my palms to my eyes, inhaling deeply. There was no going back now, and maybe that was the point. The fallout began faster than I expected. Within 48 hours of the conference, Victoria's name was circulating in the worst possible ways. An article in the business section of a major paper led with "Conference Speech Raises Questions About Prominent Local Entrepreneur." It didn't mention her directly, but the details left little doubt. By the end of the week, Richard Harlow's firm formally announced the termination of their pending contract with her company. The press release cited concerns about transparency and financial governance. It was corporate language, but the subtext was clear. They didn't trust her anymore. Other partners began to follow suit. Invitations were rescinded, collaborations dissolved. Her Instagram, once a curated gallery of luxury lunches and charity galas, turned quiet. In the silence, speculation grew louder. Then came the exposé. A local investigative journalist pieced together her financial dealings, including the family trust withdrawals, screenshots of internal memos and bank statements. Things I hadn't provided appeared in the article. I didn't have to wonder long where they came from. It was Aunt Margaret who called me, her voice steady but tinged with something that sounded like resolve. For years, she had defended Victoria, brushing off my concerns, urging me to remember she's family. Now she told me she'd given the journalist her files, records she'd kept when she briefly helped Victoria with bookkeeping. I should have spoken up sooner, she said, but I didn't want to believe it. Seeing you speak at that conference, it was like someone shook me awake. By the next morning, my inbox held an email from my lawyer. The subject line read, "New evidence acquired." The attachment was a scanned document, an unfiled agreement that detailed an unauthorized transfer from the trust into Victoria's personal account. My lawyer's note was concise. This could be significant if she tries to challenge you publicly. I closed the email and leaned back in my chair, the weight of the moment pressing down. This wasn't just about my personal vindication anymore. It was about making sure her pattern of behavior couldn't continue unchecked. But victory, as I was learning, was rarely a single moment. It unfolded in pieces. 2 weeks later, I signed the contract for a new position, Director of Strategic Initiatives at a nonprofit dedicated to supporting women in leadership. It wasn't the corporate world I'd left behind, but it felt right. Impact over image. In the evenings, I began outlining a book, not a tell-all, but a guide, part memoir, part manual, for navigating and surviving toxic family dynamics. Each chapter opened with a scene from my life, followed by strategies I wished I'd known sooner. Writing it felt like reclaiming ground I'd lost years ago. One Saturday, my niece came to visit. We walked along the park trail, the autumn leaves crunching under our feet. She skipped ahead, then circled back to match my pace. We bought hot chocolate from a vendor and sat on a bench overlooking the pond, ducks gliding across the mirrored surface. Out of nowhere, she leaned against me and whispered, "I know you're not my nanny." She glanced up, eyes wide, as if checking to see if she'd crossed some invisible line. "You're the only one who listens to me." My throat tightened. I smoothed her hair back, unsure what to say, without making promises I couldn't keep. So I settled for, "I'm always here, okay?" She nodded, sipping her cocoa, and for a while we sat in comfortable silence. The air was crisp, the kind that makes you feel both awake and at peace. It struck me then that the truest victory wasn't the headlines or the contracts lost. It was this, being present, being trusted, and knowing that at least one person in that family saw me for who I really was. Some wounds never fully close, but some, if you let them, can turn into openings for something better to grow. The apartment was on the top floor of a converted warehouse, all exposed brick and tall windows. The first morning I woke up there, I let the sunlight pour in without drawing the curtains. There was no one across the street to watch me, no reason to keep the world out, except when I chose to. The lease was in my name alone. No one but my lawyer and the building manager knew the address, not even family, especially not family. When I'd signed the papers, my lawyer had raised an eyebrow. "You're really committing to no contact?" I nodded. "Only through you." It wasn't an act of spite, it was survival. From now on, anything Victoria needed to say to me would pass through legal channels. No more late-night phone calls, No more unexpected visits or guilt-laced favors. My phone felt lighter already, as if it knew it wouldn't have to carry the weight of her voice again. Unpacking took days, not because there was so much to do, but because I wanted to choose carefully what would come into this new space. I left behind anything that carried the scent of obligation. The furniture I'd once rescued from Victoria's storage unit stayed in her garage. The framed family portraits I'd kept out of habit went into a sealed box in my closet. On the third morning, I brewed tea instead of coffee, carrying the mug to the small table by the window. The steam curled upward, the sun painting everything in gold. Outside, the city moved at its usual rhythm, buses sighing at stops, cyclists cutting between cars. But in here there was only quiet. It was a quiet I had built. I thought of all the boundaries I'd tried to set in the past, and how they'd been bent or broken. This was different. This was a fortress, not a fence. It wasn't meant to keep the world out entirely, just to keep me safe inside while I decided who got a key. By the end of the month, the outline for my book was complete, and my nonprofit contract had shifted into full-time work. But something else had been growing alongside these personal victories, a seed of an idea I couldn't ignore. I'd met too many women at the conference and online afterward who carried their own stories of family betrayal. Some were still living in it, some had escaped, but all of them had the same need: resources, legal help, housing, therapy. The things that take more than courage, they take money. So I started the Foundation for Family Freedom. The name was simple, but the mission was not. We would provide grants to women navigating the dangerous terrain of leaving toxic family systems. We would connect them with lawyers, counselors, and safe housing. We would give them what I wished I'd had when I first came home to Victoria's open arms. The first fundraising event took place 6 months later, in a rented gallery space with tall white walls and strings of Edison bulbs overhead. Guests moved between art installations, each one inspired by anonymous submissions from women helped by the foundation. Some were photographs, some sculptures, some only words on paper, lit from behind. As I made my way through the crowd, shaking hands and thanking donors, I felt the difference in how people looked at me now. It wasn't the fleeting politeness of Victoria's dinner parties. It was recognition, not of my name, but of the work. Halfway through the evening, I stepped aside into a quieter corner to check my phone. The foundation's inbox was filling with donations and messages of support. Near the top was one that stood out. No subject, no sender name. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single line: "I was once your sister's closest friend. I know something she's never told anyone, and it's bigger than anything you've uncovered so far." There was no signature, only a temporary email address, and the suggestion: "If you want the truth, reply within 48 hours. I stared at the screen, the hum of the event fading around me. Part of me wanted to ignore it. I had built something solid, something free of her shadow. Another part, the part that had once smiled through an introduction as the nanny, knew that some doors, once knocked on, demand to be opened. I slipped the phone back into my bag and returned to the main floor, accepting a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. Guests laughed and talked, the warm buzz of connection filling the air. Later, as I stood on the small stage to give my closing remarks, I looked out over the room and felt that rare mix of completion and curiosity. I had built a life that was mine, but I also knew that life was still part of a story, one with at least one more chapter waiting to be written. The applause swelled, but in my mind I could still see the message glowing in my inbox, a tiny pulse of possibility. This wasn't the end. Not yet.